but I just want to touch upon again her forthcoming book that has been already mentioned. The book will be on social normativity, and I very much look forward to reading that one. And now, without further ado, I pass the baton to Glenda, who will speak today on social normativity beyond the nature-nurture divide. So, Glenda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the organizers, Mariela, Laura, and Giuseppe, for inviting me, and also for organizing this wonderful series of workshops and hosting the network Normativity that Giuseppe described. I think this is really exciting and interesting group and research. So I'm very, very happy to be here. And also want to thank Ale for his wonderful introduction. So without further ado, let me share my slides with you today. All right. So the topic, the topic, as Ale already mentioned, is social normativity beyond the nature-nurture divide. And before I get into the quite a specific topic I want to discuss today, I want to give a sort of overview of the framework in which this project makes sense, or at least makes sense to me within my research. And it starts like this. Most of what we do together with others. Since childhood, we engage in all sorts of shared activities that help shape our skill repertoires and our acting capacities. Newborn babies coordinate their movements with others in order to be fed and continue to do so in different ways through their development. As, for example, when they learn how to use a spoon or sit at a table. This progress is intertwined with various forms of joint play and shared activity with caregivers and also peers. And as adults, even more so, we engage in a great variety of cooperative activities with others as well. Those range from very simple forms of activities such as walking or dancing together, which have been popular examples in the literature, but also other activities that involve sophisticated forms of communication and organizing, like working together at a university or planning together a conference, of which we are very familiar, I guess. And more so, these social practices involve normative demands, and these normative demands underpin those practices. And those normative demands range from activities such as greeting, cooking, dressing, to running a state or managing a pandemics. What is characteristic of these practices is that they are practices in which we assess each other's actions as correct or incorrect, or right or wrong. And by doing this, we thereby treat these actions as according or failing to accord with different standards of correction or norms. These assessments and our conformity to them help shape these practices. They help them change or persist as they are. More so, as Giuseppe was saying as well, many non-human forms of life also seem to be structured according to common standards or social norms. And it has been argued that chimps and bonobos, with which we share our last common ancestor, have social life organized through social patterns of behavior or common standards of behavior, but also dogs, elephants, birds, especially, for example, crows. So many animals have been described as having some form of social life organized around some sort of social norms. But although social normativity is an ubiquitous phenomenon, and this can be preliminarily described, as I would like to do, as the prevailing of standards, rules, or patterns of behavior that prevail within a community or group through mutual reinforcement, even if we can give this general description, the question of how to understand the psychological capacities underpinning social normativity remains controversial. And why is this? In the domain of developmental and comparative psychology, in which I'm going to place this intervention, one of the central problems is that normative behavior is taken to involve very cognitively sophisticated psychological capacities, those kinds of psychological capacities that perhaps only linguistic creatures can have. And this, at least in two fronts. On the one hand, it is claimed that in order to follow a norm, creatures need to have conscious awareness of the norm, and they have to grasp the content of the norm. There's a variety of authors have argued this, from philosophy as well as developmental psychology and primatology. Second, is thought that to learn a norm and to apply the norm to others, to attribute the norm to others, we need, or the creatures at issue need, sophisticated capacities of mind reading. That is, the capacity to represent the mental states of other people from whom the norm is supposed to be learned, or to which the norm is going to be attributed. These pervasive assumptions in the literature create what I believe to be two intractable problems. The first one is that these views cannot explain how human infants and some non-linguistic animals may be able to learn and follow social norms, even if they live, as they do, within some kind of social organized life or social normative practices broadly conceived. This means that the views are empirically inadequate. The second intractable problem is that the views tend to presuppose what needs explaining, namely the emergence and nature of capacities of social cognition, of forced social cognition. In many of these views, this capacity of representing other people's mental states or other agents' mental states is innate, but that only pushes the problem backwards. For if we are looking at phylogenesis, at some point we would need to explain exactly how these practices emerge. Now, this is my hypothesis, very general hypothesis within which this talk is placed. If learning and following social norms could be shown not to require much psychological sophistication, then engagement with them and participation in social practices could help explain how mind reading of the sophisticated kind, which might, I believe, be only human, a very sophisticated kind, could have emerged out of specific social practices. And those practices which perhaps involve language and social narratives. And this is part of the general NOC program, the Natural Knowledge of Content program, in which I have been working for some years. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, or maybe I won't even mention it again, but I thought to give some overall view of where this talk is placed. Now, in this presentation, I offer an articulation of the concept of social affordances in its different kinds. This is based on Gibson's and others' ecological theory of perception that centers around the concept of affordances. And the idea there is to show how this augmented notion of social affordances can help us understand how learning and following social norms are possible even when there is no linguistic or even no sophisticated representational capacities. This will make room for a continuous developmental and phylogenetical account of our capacities for social and collective intentionality. That's the hope. Today, because I don't have a lot of time, I will focus especially on social norms in the case of human infants, but I believe that the same toolbox and strategy can address the case of following and learning social norms in other non-linguistic animals. I have written one paper together with Ali on this topic in the case of chimps. I won't be talking about that, but structurally there will be a coincidence that will be noticeable, I hope. All right, so social affordances and social norms. So the ecological theory of perception is famous for introducing two radical hypotheses. The first one is that perception is direct and relational. To perceive the environment, we don't need to build and manipulate mental representations. Rather, what we do is detect and respond to information that is available in the environment. This means that perception is not something that happens within an organism, but between an organism and its environment. The second radical hypothesis is that perception is fundamentally perception of affordances. Affordances are opportunities for actions that a specific environment offers to a specific organism. And this depends on the specific features of this organism, its size, its shape, etc. So when we detect information about an object, for example, a glass, and I will take the opportunity to have a sip of water, the first thing we perceive is the actions that we can carry out with it, such as, for example, as I did, picking it up, drinking from it, throwing it, etc. The thesis that perception is of affordances also implies that perception and action are complementary processes. You can't have perception without action or action without perception. They come in a tandem. They are codependent, interdefined. Now, what is then perceiving together in this context? So shared attention, as is named in the literature, is a situation in which two agents are mutually aware of themselves attending to the same objects. And in the vocabulary of affordances, this would be a social or a shared affordance. Yet, unfortunately, the literature, ecological literature, hasn't been very precise in specifying what it means to share an affordance. So there has been a lot of empirical evidence relating to perception of affordances in motor control tasks, in the individual case, but not enough attention to what I will call the peculiarities of human perception and action, maybe not only human, in particular, the social aspects of interaction and the cultural norms that permeate groups of humans, maybe other great apes, maybe even other animals as well, and how these affect the perception of affordances. So what I want to do, as I said, is to explore perception and action when this is a matter of an agent relating to another agent. And what I want to do is offer more nuanced concepts that we don't find in the literature to make distinctions. And this, I will claim, allows us to address and explain how social norms can permeate human action and perception without involving any sophisticated representational capacities or linguistic capacities. So this is the outline. I'm going to say something quite general about social norms and how they permeate human perception. As I said, I'm going to focus on ontogeny, on development, so I will be mostly speaking of the human case, though you will see I will make reference to other animals as well. And then I want to expand on the concept of social affordance, and I will give you some characterizations of what social affordances might be. And then I will use this analysis to address the learning and becoming entrenched into sociocultural norms and sociocultural normative practices. Okay. What are social cultural norms? They are patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting all broadly understood that have their origin in a practice that prevails in the context of a community of agents. And maybe I should add, as I said at the beginning, that this depends on the mutual reinforcement by the agent. So these norms emerge from the intersubjective evaluation or mutual reinforcements that the community members exert of each other's actions. They express the group's expectations for how anyone who will be one of us should act on pain of admonition, punishment, or ostracism. Now, unsurprisingly, most of our actions are mediated by sociocultural norms. And this is because, as Haugeland points out, when community members behave normally, how they behave is in general directly accountable in terms of what is normal in their community. And different communities are different with respect to what is normal in them. And the disposition of these community members have been inculcated and shaped according to these norms. And through development and learning, but not only. They continue to be monitored for compliance. Okay. Now, some ecological psychologists have reflected on this fact. They have talked about how taking of affordances can be affected by social norms, and this constantly in our everyday situations. For example, we tend not to eat with our hands, for a normative reason, says Eras Escribano, even if grasping the food with our hands could be more expedient, more efficient. So we have pressure from the norms to take or not take affordances, depending on what social norms we follow. Not only this, but communities have specialized roles that relate to gender, age, and socioeconomic status, and these roles restrict the affordances that can be used. People sit differently depending on the gender they identify with, for example. Okay. Some ecological psychologists have called these canonical affordances. And canonical affordances are not only affordances that are the result of restricting the natural affordances that are available, but also some affordances are exclusively the product of these norms. So they only exist in relation to the social normative context. They can only be perceived by individuals who are aware of the norms. So for example, a metal box offers the possibility of sending and receiving letters only in a community that has a postal system and only for those who are familiar with it. So social norms play a fundamental role both in creating and shaping our interaction with affordances. Yet it's important to realize that these norms are seldom verbalized. They are manifested as more as embodied habits of perception and action, the way we sit or the way we move our hands. They predispose us to perceive and take advantages of certain affordances instead of others and in particular situation. So this fact, I believe, is undeniable. But how do we learn to behave according to these social norms or to perceive these special affordances? Most of authors, and this goes beyond ecological literature, I think it may be a point of consensus across different ways of conceptualizing the basic components of cognition. The social norms are acquired through social interaction. And it is in social interaction that we learn to coordinate our perception action with respect to these norms, we will say in this vocabulary. So how does learning of social norms work? Gibson remarks that it is a mistake to construct a behavior theory without reference to social interaction and attach it only at the end. And this is because since very early age, adults are guiding children's attention to objects and show them either implicitly or through demonstrations or in the context of cooperative actions how to interact with objects appropriately. These acts of joint attention, says Heft, contribute to the developing patterns of selection in perception action, a process of guided attunement, which forms a crucial part of the child's history as an agent. Yet, surprisingly in this case, most ecological psychologists tend to adopt a sort of individualistic approach when they study perceptual learning, as I already said. They focus on individual access and management and engagement with affordances, and they ignore the role that social interaction plays in the process. But even ecological psychologists that are quite invested in the social dimensions of perception and action call on Tomasello's theory that relies on simulation theory and theory to explain how children learn social norms. And this is surprisingly because Tomasello's account of social cognition builds on notions such as meta-representations of representations of others, and on recursive inference to explain our ability to make adaptive reasoning with respect to what others will do, in order to explain how is it that we get to understand what others are up to. And that is required for learning social norms in his view. Now, this doesn't sit well at all with ecological psychology, and it doesn't sit well with the idea that perception is direct. And I want to suggest that maybe even social perception is direct, should be conceived as direct. And I will say more about this in a minute. So it looks like we could start with this idea of affordances that comes from ecological psychology, and then see how we can develop this notion in terms that involve social interaction. And maybe there we'll be in the position to explain how collective norms come to permeate perception and action, and avoid the excessively cognitively demanding, neurocentric, individualistic explanation that we get from Thomas Elo, which relates to what I was explaining at the very beginning. So in what I have left of the time, I want to answer these two questions: how social norms and social interaction influence human perception and action. And I want to ask, how can we give an ecological account of the basic forms of shared attention that lay at the basis of acquisition of social cultural norms? I want to say yes, and I want to tell you briefly how I think that should go. So two ideas are key from ecological psychology here against theory and simulation theory, conceptions of social condition. The first one is that we can perceive affordances of other agents directly, as we perceive the affordances of objects as directly as such. And second, that we don't need meta-representations or abductive inferences to explain our ability to understand, at least in basic cases, what others are doing and to cooperate with them carrying common goals, which, as we will see, is also something that some ecological psychologists have emphasized. Okay. So I said already that in a way, the social dimension, social character of affordances is pervasive. Maybe all or almost all human affordances have a social character. This is because our environment is mediated by social norms that belong to the community that we partake in. But it's also because the environment has been transformed by the action of human beings. It has the stamp of the social. It's the example of the metal box in the post. All right. And I know the time is pressing, but I need to read this amazing passage from Gibson, who says, "The richest and most elaborate affordances of the environment are provided by other animals, and for us, other people. Behavior affords behavior, and the whole subject matter of psychology and the social sciences can be thought as an elaboration of this basic fact. So sexual behavior, nurturing behavior, fighting behavior, cooperative behavior, economic, political behavior, all depend on the perceiving of what another person or other persons afford, or sometimes on the misperceiving of it." So social affordances are pervasive. Maybe they are the central subject matter of both psychology and social sciences. What are they? Let me start with a very minimal characterization. Social affordances are opportunities for actions that depend on the presence in the environment of one or more agents with whom I can interact. This is a very broad characterization of what a social affordances are. Furthermore, a study of social affordances requires taking as a minimum unit of reference the organism-environment system, so OOE, rather than OE, organism-environment system, of classical ecological theory. So we said that the richest and more elaborate affordances of the environment are provided by other animals and for us people, but how are they richer? So what I want to do now is to distinguish 4 types of social affordances. And then once we have done this in the context of organism environment system, explain how this framework allows us to understand how social norms come to permeate perception and action without resorting to complex representations or linguistic representations. The most basic type is one in which there is information about the affordances of other organisms in the environment. So this is a case where there is an agent O1, and there's something in the environment that O2 has left there, has put there, and that modifies the perception of the environment of the first organism. So an example of this is when it's very pervasive in the animal kingdom. Some predators, for example, are able to follow the trail of prey by perceiving the smell they leave. For example, dogs and wolves can determine the proximity of prey based on the intensity of the smell. There are also interesting studies about ants and how ants also leave a smell trail in their path so that other ants can follow them. The second kind, I call it indirect perception, and this is when an agent perceives another agent doing something, and that gives this first agent information about the environment. So a very famous example again, vervet monkeys emit characteristic sound to alert their conspecifics about the presence of predators in the surroundings. And this generates differentiated responses in other members of the group. It's important to realize that this is not a case of joint action or shared attention, because this can happen in the absence of the realization that the other organism is perceiving the first organism one. So it is not it's not necessarily reciprocal. And in the case of humans, this capacity seems quite pervasive as well, the capacity to perceive the reactions of others to the environment. A third variety is very similar, but this time we're talking about the ability to detect the affordances that are relevant and significant for an agent by becoming aware of the agent's mental states. So we can see an agent and realize that this agent is angry, or it has an aggressive attitude, or intends to cooperate with us. So in this case, the information about the environment is not what is key. What is key is the attitude of the other organism. And there is a very, extended or endorsed conception of social cognition, understood in terms of direct social perception, that comes from embodied cognitive science, which in a number of different authors, both from phenomenology and not, have defended a view like this, that humans are able to directly perceive emotions and intentions of others. And so this fits within that as well. Now, this capacity of direct social perception of the mental states or attitudes of other agents is essential for yet another type of social affordance. This is interpersonal coordination, or affordances within interpersonal coordination. This is when not only I'm aware of the intention of other agent, but there is a decision to carry a joint action together. And a new unit of perception action is created, a sort of plural subject of action is created when this happens, because perception action is coordinated with the other to achieve a common goal. And just very briefly, a quote from Marsh, I'm going to read only a little bit of it. The perception and action capabilities of the social unit are mutually constrained, ordered, and dynamically coupled in this situation. So perceiving and acting of those individuals within the social unit are causally entailed to one another and with the object with which they are interacting. And they form a system where each one's actions and the reactions of the objects are all working together and at the same time. So there is an example there, carrying a table together, very popular example from the literature on joint action. And the important thing about this description is that in this, there is no simulation or inferences about what the other agent is doing. It's just direct perception of what they are doing, coordination of both the affordances we perceive in the other and the affordances that come from the object of common attention. And that is sufficient to understand how these two organisms and the object are interacting with each other. And this has been argued as something similar, could be argued that gestures work similarly. We can understand how understanding gestures works just in a very, very similar way as the one I just described, as Reed argues, another ecological psychologist. Okay, so there is perception of the action of the other agent, and the agent must coordinate the responses and to be successful in the action they are performing together. Okay, so summary so far, the ecological perspective offers resources to understand social interaction without the need to postulate complex processes involving theory or simulation theory. The notion of social affordances allows us to understand how this is possible, how we can understand social interaction without such cognitive complex mechanisms. And this is a firm foundation to explain how norms are learned. And in the few minutes I have left, I will address exactly that. As I said, I'm going to focus specifically on the case of human ontogeny. All right. So children are in contact with normative social practices from birth. And caregivers often carry out actions, gestures, facial expressions, sounds with the aim of regulating children's perception, action, patterns of response. These actions encode norms, values, pattern practices distinctive of their specific sociocultural milieu. And these physical interventions of the caregiver to the baby are arguably, as Kruger says, the earliest examples of social practices that scaffold the infant cognitive development and shape their cultural education. So the perception of social affordances is key to account for these early forms of cultural learning. So I'm going to point to some landmark or milestones and capacities that are very important to understand how social cultural norms are acquired in early infancy. And with that, I will aim to have shown you that we can give this explanation without resorting to any cognitive complex mechanisms. All right. So there's evidence that human beings are able to dynamically coordinate their movements with others. And in this, we might think is a fundamental aspect of learning social norms once correctly conceived. And precisely what is at issue is learning some ways of acting and responding to the environment. And empirical evidence suggests that this might be even an innate capacity within the set of capacities or the set of abilities that Trevarten calls primary intersubjectivity. These are interactive capacities that children have from birth and almost exclusively until the 6 months of age, where other capacities for interaction kick in. There's a variety. I'm not going to comment on all the forms of different sets of studies. Suffices to say that there is evidence at 2 months of age, babies can identify a particular style of picking up of a specific caregiver that they have, and they tend to accommodate their bodies to the specific pickup. So there is a coordination of bodily movement to the style of the caregiver. And this as well is connected with the ability to somehow perceive the intention of another agent, the intention to pick them up. But this intention, and there has been a number of different studies, again, across different sort of ways of approaching cognition, that show that very basic clues are sufficient for us to attribute intention. Maybe even dots, lights, and movement, we could attribute a specific intention to those images. And this capacity seems to be innate. This suggests that social interaction could be based on the perception of affordances of other agents, social affordances in our terminology, without the need to carry any abductive inferences or use of meta-representations. And the fact that children are able to coordinate the perception action to the behavioral habits of the caregivers could be conceived to be a first form of conformity, social conformity, or conformity to social norms of a very basic kind. Another key capacity is the capacity to perceive emotional responses of others, which again has been observed as early as 2 months, where children coordinately react to the facial expression of caregivers. There are some very famous experiments, such as the still face experiment, that show that babies adapt and coordinate the responses to the emotional facial expressions of their caregivers. And this sensitivity to facial gestures and also vocalization is a very early form of social information that helps babies adapt their own actions in real time. And these emotional responses give a sort of a platform for the development of the understanding of what actions are acceptable, how I should continue or not continue in a specific context of interactions. So the actions of others, the gestures of others provide sensory information about affordances that the child can perceive and use to coordinate her actions. So here we have an example of these two different forms of social affordances, where the attention is in the attitude or the attention is in the environment through the attitude. But now this environment and these attitudes are social-cultural, explicitly social-cultural.
Glenda,
Okay.
just to make you aware of the time.
Yeah. 3 more minutes and I finish, if that's okay. Thank you. All right. So joint attention. So joint attention it's crucial, as we said already, in the learning of social norms. And this is when there is mutual awareness by two agents of the presence of features of an object in the environment they are both attending to. This kicks in 6-9 months of age for baby. And that it means that the baby follows the gaze of the adult when they is perceiving an object and tries to read that meaning of that object through the gaze of the adult. Again, this happens in the context of gestures and vocalizations by adults. And this is yet another form of education of attention. The child grows. As the child grows, the child herself is going to point to things of interest and expect the following of the gaze of others. And this is where later on they will place words, maybe one word for many things, like my first child will say water for everything. Okay, so the child in doing this is learning and adapting to social norms by interacting with caregivers and the cultural material environment. She is habitualizing to these patterns of perception action. And these norms, patterns of thought, feeling, and action are manifested as embodied habits of perception and actions that predispose the child to perceive and take advantage of certain affordances instead of others in particular situations. So they start incorporating some very explicit sociocultural norms, such as use the spoon and the plate, or the chopsticks, do not use your hands. So the ability to synchronize attention with others, it's key in this process. And the other thing I want to say, and I guess I will say it very quickly, but we can talk more in the Q&A, imitation is very central. And imitation here has been discussed, again, for a great variety of different oriented researches within developmental psychology and primatology. Over imitation, that the children imitate all the actions of the adults, even things that seem irrelevant to the successful achieving of the end. And that it's very important in this period of learning of social norms through bodily posture, attitudes, and perceiving of affordances. And it ends with demanding others to conform to norms around 2 to 3 years of age, as a study of Rakosa and Tomasello discusses. All right. Importantly, imitation doesn't happen. It's not just one-sided. It doesn't involve joint action, but it involves joint attention in the sense that the child expects the gaze from the adult to regulate her action for acceptance or adequacy. And so there is a use of approval and disapproval. And this means that all of this process is a process of mind shaping, or regulative process, as Savitsky and McGeer call it. That is not so much mind reading, but a social capacity that both the caregiver and the child have to mutually shape one another's minds, stabilizing, controlling, and making them more predictable over time. So then we reach, and this is almost the last slide, Ale, a a scheme where we have the two organisms interacting, and their interactions are mediated by social norms, and so is the environment. The environment is pervasively infused by sociocultural patterns of perception and action. So, with this, I conclude. I have argued that social interactions, joint attention, and joint action are all key to learning social norms. And this can be explained through direct perception of social affordances and mutual awareness of common affordances without any meta-representations or inferences about the mental states of other agents. In this, sociocultural learning depends on habitualization to embody sociocultural norms that we learn from other community members from very early childhood. And the notion of social affordances in different types provides fundamental tools to make sense of this and allows us to understand how children come to act according to what is considered normal or acceptable within their communities before and independently of the ability to articulate these norms in language. Thank you so much. There goes the quote of the paper that it's published. And thanks so much to my co-author, my former PhD student, Miguel Segundo Ortin.